Hey guys, I wanted to speak about social anxiety today. And when I speak on this topic, I'm really speaking from personal experience. In my teens, all the way to my mid 20s, I was an incredibly socially anxious person. It was to the point that I would agonize over a gathering, a party, in the days leading up to it, which I later learned is called anticipatory anxiety, and it's a very common symptom of social anxiety. And I would agonize particularly over what I was going to wear, how I was going to do my makeup, and things like that. And then once I get to the actual party, the social event, I would get incredibly distressed very quickly. Like I would scan the room. I would make some attempt to make small talk, and then I remember the worst instance was maybe about 5-10 minutes of me trying to make small talk. The distress just got so high that I excused myself and I just went out, like found a little secluded corner to just cry, to just walk around and cry to myself. That's really resolved in the subsequent years, probably just growing up, maturing. But I've also learned a lot about psychology, learned a lot about social anxiety. So I wanted to share kind of a mixture of the clinical knowledge that I have acquired and also just kind of personal reflection. I feel like for people who don't experience this, this stuff might seem kind of basic, but for people who experience social anxiety, especially if you're on the younger side, I hope that there'll be some helpful things in here for you. And I also know that everyone's experience with social anxiety is different. We probably have different presentations, different symptoms, different things that we fear, different concerns that we have, and different etiologies, right? Like different prior experiences and situations growing up that gave us this thing that we call social anxiety, but it'll manifest in different ways. So I would love to hear about your individual experience. It's a knowledge sharing community. I love to hear what you think of this down in the comments below. So I think we can start with the theory, the model, and then I will speak on how I personally resonate with this, and adding some personal tidbits to make it kind of more concrete and human. So this is the cognitive model of social anxiety disorder. It's an incredibly well-validated model. This is what therapists get trained on. This is what they use to treat social anxiety. So I feel like it'll be quite useful for us to know it as well. So the idea is that you enter a social situation. That's pretty self-explanatory. And whether you are thinking of going into a social situation or you are already in one, that activates some assumptions about yourself, and they tend to be quite negative, right? Like if you're socially anxious, you might think that you are awkward, you are uninteresting, or you'll always be a loner, that kind of things. And it also includes negative assumptions about others. So it might be that others are judgmental, these people are cliquey, they will never include me, or they'll have very, very high standard for me. Like if I don't present as funny or friendly or interesting to usually an unrealistic degree, then I will never be accepted by these people. So because those negative assumptions are activated, you then perceive a lot of social threat, social danger. That's where that little bubble is. The thing is, people's behavior are usually ambiguous. They're usually neutral. And what happens in social anxiety, as theorized, is that because you already have these negative assumptions about yourself and others, it kind of acts as a tinted lens through which you are seeing the world, seeing other people's behavior. And so even though they might be acting in kind of a neutral way, you might perceive that as they're judging you, they're rejecting you. So there's really this biased information processing, and the sense of threat is really amplified. And then here's the kicker. This is what I think is a really crucial part of the model. It's the processing of self as object. So scientists, researchers, they've done a lot of studies. They maybe interviewed socially anxious people, and they found that one common denominator across people with social anxiety is that when they're in social situations, they are hyper-focused on themselves. And more specifically, they're hyper-focused on themselves as an object, as a social object. So they're seeing kind of like how others see them. And that's usually very negative. I hope that makes sense. So they're hyper-focused on this image of how they're coming across as nervous, as awkward, as uninteresting to others. And then what happens is there are some somatic and cognitive symptoms that comes with this. So somatic means physical. Some people may experience their anxiety more in their bodies. So this can be racing heart rate, sweating, shaking, blushing. Some people may experience it more as racing thoughts and these negative thoughts, and these are more of the cognitive. And I think for most of us, it's a blend of the two, although you might be leaning towards one or the other. Like if you're very heady person, you might be experiencing more cognitive symptoms. And if you're more, physical, you might experience more physical symptoms. But it's usually a blend of the two. And then what happens is once you start having those physical sensations, emotions, thoughts, that draws your attention to yourself even more. Because that's what our emotions and physiology have evolved to do, right? Evolutionarily speaking, when we detect that our heart rate is increasing, we are feeling a sense of danger, it's adaptive for those things to draw our attention, because then we can act to defend ourselves against threats. So that's very understandable. But then what happens is there's a feedback loop that's kind of created between these. The more you experience this, the more you pay attention to these symptoms. And it's kind of like what happens in a panic attack. So I never had personal first-hand experience of panic attacks, but this is what I've read. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you have personal experiences with panic attacks. What happens in a panic attack is you already are quite hypervigilant to your heart rate and things like that. And then once you notice that your heart rate is starting to increase, you focus on that, and that creates anxiety. And the more you focus on that, the more your heart rate rises, and that creates this positive feedback loop until you reach a full-blown panic attack. And then kind of the last piece of this model is the safety behaviors. So these are things that people do because they feel like they can make themselves feel safer. Usually these are avoidant tactics. One thing that I'm sure a lot of people do is when they start feeling uncomfortable, start feeling anxious in a social situation, they maybe look at their phones. And I'm guilty of this as well. Like sometimes I say I want to go to the bathroom just to get some space to myself, like not because I actually need to go. Other common ones that you see in a lot of textbooks is avoiding eye contact, or putting on makeup to cover your blushing. And what the theories say about safety behaviors is that they are really the key piece of the puzzle to why social anxiety doesn't kind of just cure itself. So anxiety disorders, the gold standard treatment for any kind of anxiety is usually exposure. If you have a phobia of something, your therapist might create, say you're afraid of spiders, your therapist might create this graded hierarchy from something like, a cute spider plushie all the way to like touching a real spider, right? And then you just have to face your fears, and you can face your fears in this gradual way, but ultimately the cure to fear is to expose yourself to that fear. Same with PTSD. Exposure therapy requires you to retell and essentially re-experience the traumatic event in a vivid way, and it can be a very, very brutal and grueling process, but that is the key to curing your anxiety. Confront your fears. But the puzzle with social anxiety is that social interactions are kind of inescapable, right? Like, even if you shut yourself in your home, you still, like, our survival, day-to-day living requires you to interact with others. So exposure is kind of like necessary. It's built into your life. So it becomes an interesting theoretical puzzle as to why social anxiety doesn't just cure itself over time. And what researchers have landed on is that it's because of the safety behaviors. So people go into a social situation, they feel uncomfortable, they engage in, whatever their safety behavior of choice is. And then once they come out of that social interaction, if nothing bad, nothing catastrophic happens, then they attribute that non-occurrence of the catastrophe to the safety behavior. So they might think that, I only did okay at that party because I rehearsed some jokes, or I didn't talk too much about myself. I made a conscious effort to not do this and do that. So that doesn't touch their core assumption that if I just relax and be myself, then others will reject me, right? Like, they never test that possibility. So that possibility never gets disaffirmed. And the other thing about safety behaviors is that sometimes they can unintentionally have a paradoxical self-defeating consequence. So one classic example that's in a lot of textbooks is that people might be shy, and then because they're uncomfortable and shy, they avoid eye contact. But from the outsider perspective, because they don't know that you're just shy and you're just anxious, they just see someone who isn't willing to make eye contact, and that might paradoxically come across as cold, unfriendly, aloof, or hostile. So it's doing kind of the opposite of what you wanted to do. And just for completion's sake, I might as well talk about the two other components. That's preview and review. So preview is that anticipatory anxiety that I spoke about at the start of the video. It's that agonizing, excessive planning, excessive worrying before you go to a social gathering, a social event. So what that does is that it already makes you very distressed. It already makes you quite anxious. And a lot of that is probably, because of the associative nature of our mind. You're worried about performing badly or things going badly in the next social situation. Your brain naturally brings up other memories of prior times that you think you've done badly. And you might not necessarily even have done badly at all, but that's the way that a socially anxious mind thinks. So you're already like bringing up all these negative memories. You're already feeling quite on edge. That kind of just fuels what I said earlier about that tinted lens. You're already primed to see things in a threatening way, even before going into it. So you're kind of setting yourself up for failure. And then review, otherwise known as post-mortem, and that's what they call it in kind of the clinical literature. It's that like replaying, right? Like, after you've come home and then you're laying in bed, you're like worrying about how you did, you're going over every detail. And once again, because you are already kind of primed to ignore the positive, right? Like, people may have been quite interested in you and quite friendly towards you, but your mind is downplaying that, right? Because of the core negative assumptions that you have about yourself and others. So in your post-mortem, you're reinterpreting these events in kind of like a negative way again. So that's just adding fuel to the flame. So these two things that kind of happens before and after the situation, this whole bit is like during the social situation, but they all kind of play in tandem, and they all kind of feed into each other in this feedback loop. So with the model, the theories out of the way, I wanted to talk a bit more about my personal experience and how I personally resonate with that model and make use of that model in my everyday life. So I wanted to start with that core assumption, the negative assumption about self and others that's at the top of that model. One thing that I learned that has really helped me over the years is this thing called the glass frog effect. And I have to give credit to Patrick Tehan. He is a counselor, I think, who specializes in and talks about complex trauma, CPTSD. I'll put his name on the screen right now so you can check him out. But the glass frog effect is essentially the idea that people who have been through a lot, and I don't believe you need to necessarily have like clinically diagnosable levels of complex trauma to experience this, but you know, if you're just someone who has been through a lot, you know, you've had negative experiences with others, you carry a lot of heaviness within you, you sometimes can feel like you're just different from others, and there's this sense that like others can see through you, they can see through your difference, you know, your regrets, your self-perceived failures. But that's not really true, right? Like others don't really know about our deep history, especially if you're meeting someone new, you're entering into a new situation. Like all they know is what you give them, right? So every encounter, every new person, new situation is really an opportunity for you to reinvent yourself. And I find that to be a very liberating and kind of freeing thing to have in mind. To really tackle things at the root, you really have to introspect and like sit with yourself and understand what it is that you feel, right? Like what it is that you fundamentally dislike or are dissatisfied with within yourself. And then to examine that, like are those beliefs really true? For me, I spoke at the start of the video about my excessive anxiety about what to wear and what, you know, how I'm putting on makeup and stuff. And I think that really goes back a very long way to my childhood. I was overweight as a child and I was bullied because of that. And I think, you know, as girls, there's so much messaging from society that your appearance matters so much. And on top of that, you know, I had Asian caregivers who aren't like super verbally affirming. Like they're loving and they're giving, they're very devoted, but they're not very verbal about their love and their affirmation. So I never really, you know, was told that I was beautiful growing up. And I think that then develops into an obsession, kind of like a fixation on that. So understanding that and understanding where those things come from, and you know, that might not be realistic. Like beauty might be a curse, you know. I don't need to be an incredibly beautiful person to be worthy of being loved and respected and listened to. I think that understanding where they come from and tackling those things head on has helped me just being at ease with myself generally. And interestingly, another thing that I noticed just with introspection that I fear a lot is not being in the know, right? Like not being, not having like some common knowledge, almost like secret codes that others know that I don't. And I think that comes from migrating to another country as a teenager. Like, I was so worried about fitting in. I didn't know what, kids here talked about, what they enjoy, what they watch, what music they listen to, and I really desperately wanted to know and fit in. And then later on, in my 20s, I kind of got into this community of, I guess, hip-hop enjoyers, hip-hop lovers, right? And I would feel super self-conscious and embarrassed when I don't know a particular person, a particular thing about hip-hop culture. I think this is so funny, but people were talking about John Baden. I think he's a podcaster, he music reviewer, and the whole conversation I thought they were talking about Joe Biden. And when they found out and they all laughed, probably, it was pretty innocuous, but I was so mortified. But now in hindsight, I understand that people have different interests. Like, people listen to different types of music, consume different types of media, and like, it's completely fine and chill for me to not know about a particular thing. But I think, at the time when having a community around me, when having friends around me feels like a survival need, right? Like, my body was so hyper vigilant, it was so it just perceived it as something so consequential and threatening when it really wasn't. But when I'm talking about changing core beliefs, really tackling these insecurities by way of self-reflection and understanding more about the world, taking on a different perspective, these things they're very slow. It's a very slow process. In cognitive behavioral therapy, usually the last step, like months and even years into your therapy, your therapists are finally considering like tackling and changing your core beliefs. And they talk about how, it really has to come with lived experience, where you've done things, you've experienced things that tell you in a very visceral, concrete way that your core beliefs are not true. It really takes so much to get to the bottom of that. So that it's not super practical to suggest that as a short-term strategy, even though it's very worth doing. It's very, very worthwhile, of course. But I think the next piece of that model offers the key to kind of a more short-term, immediate solution to social anxiety. It's that, if you remember, self as object, focused attention on self as object. So what that means is like, what's contributing to our distress, our anxiety, is really where we are putting our attention during a social interaction. It's that self-consciousness, that focus of attention on yourselves. That's really the problem. What you want to do in a social situation is to pay attention to others, to really take an interest in them, to get to know them. And once you kind of adopt that curious stance, once you really let yourself go with the flow, then naturally your anxiety will decrease as you're no longer so self-conscious, because our attention span is limited, right? Like, our attention capacity, is limited. Once we are wholeheartedly focused on one thing, we can't focus on the other thing. So if you're really taking an interest in getting to know the person in front of you, then you sort of automatically can't focus on and worry about, whether you're sweating or not, like how you're looking, whether you are gesticulating in a weird way. And for me, that really comes with like changing mindset. So I think subconsciously, it's absurd almost to kind of say this out loud, but I think when I was really in the grips of social anxiety, it feels like a competition. It almost feels like an interview, right? It feels like I'm going on some kind of stage to be judged on all aspects of me, like from my mannerism to the way I look to the contents of my mind, But it's not really like that, and it shouldn't be like that. try to remind yourself before going into a social situation that you are more like a participant, right? You're more like an audience member, if anything. You are there not to be the star, not to be scrutinized, not to be judged. You are just there like everybody else is, on an equal footing. You're there to experience it, to not necessarily even enjoy it, but just to experience it and let it happen. Again, it might sound pretty basic to some of y'all, but it's actually a very crucial epiphany and kind of like a moment of transition for me. And I wanted to add one last tidbit. This is my own kind of personal invention, right? My own coinage, if you will. It's that when you feel threatened, right? When you feel really unsafe and like alienated, it's almost like everybody else morphs into this just threat. They're no longer individual people. They're just this threat. And I call it the homogeneity of the outgroup. I feel like when you're under threat, there's a tendency to think that like, oh, everybody else is this and only I am that, right? Like everybody here, they're so confident, they're so attractive, they're so cool, they're so successful, and only I am unattractive, uninteresting, awkward, blah blah blah, right? And I think that when you are aware that this is what your mind does, then you can start to unravel it. And the way that you unravel that is by paying attention, being observant, and taking interest in each person as an individual, learning their story, understanding their struggles, their vulnerabilities. Maybe you're not getting that deep yet if it's just a small talk situation, but like understanding, take an interest in what they're interested in, what they choose to talk about. I think that those would really help in the short term. I've rambled on for long enough. I hope that it's helpful. I hope that that was interesting. I will link some of my sources in the description if you're interested. It comes from a therapy training technical manual, but I'm sure like if you want something that's more accessible, there are plenty of information on the internet. If you've made it to the end, thank you so much for tuning in and listening. I hope that was helpful, and I hope to see you next time. Have a good day, guys. See you.